To help future air crews prepare themselves for air combat, records and artifacts of the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society are available today in the Cadet Library of the United States Air Force Academy. Through this collection, cadets experience vicariously the challenges faced by a flyer shot down in enemy territory. Ralph Patton, the founder and first president of the Society, tells how the group began.
Afees started actually one winter night in 1953 when I received a telephone call from a chap that I had lived with for the 62 days during our evasion from Brittany in 1944. Lieutenant Norman R. King from Albany, New York phoned me and he said in 1953, he said, "My wife Betty and I are going back to France to visit the people that we lived with during the war in the spring of next year. Would you and your wife Betty be interested in going along?" Well, I thought about that, but I called him back a week later and I said I had arranged. When I returned from France in '44, I had taken the money that was back pay and I had invested it in a war bond. And that war bond had matured, so I had $500. So I went to my dad and I said, "Could I borrow $500? And he said, "Sure, what are you going to do with it?" So I told him. He was very happy to lend it to me. So Betty and I, with the borrowed money and our cashed-in war bond, joined Norm King and his wife Betty, and we went back to France in 1954. Well, that visit was so successful that it stimulated us to save our nickels and dimes. We went back again in 1961. And in '61, that visit culminated when the French leader of the underground gave me, personally, a list of 94 American airmen that had escaped from France the way I did. And I thought, gee, I took that list back with me. I was living in Buffalo, New York at the time. And I took that list back with me, and there was a chap there from Niagara Falls. So I went to visit him one day while I was over there on business, and I showed him the list, and he says, "Geez," he says, "why don't we get a reunion of these people?" I said, "Well, that's a pretty good idea. I can get the Frenchmen to come over, and I can find the Canadians that were the leaders of this operation, and I can get the group together." So I started to work on it, and this John Amory promptly moved out of town, and I've never seen him since. So I was sort of stuck with organizing the reunion in June of 1964. We had our reunion in Buffalo, New York. Now, at the same time, a Frenchman by the name of Leslie Atkinson was organizing a group of the helpers in France. So between Leslie and I, we were able to put together a pretty good reunion of the people that I had met in France in 1961, and it led me to Lucien Dumais, who was the leader of it was a Canadian, and he was the chief of the Réseau, as they call it, which is a resistance network, and his second in command and radio operator was Raymond Labrosse, who was from Ottawa. Lucien was from Montreal. So I was able to get the two of them, who had organized the resistance network, and Mathieu Branchou, who was from Guingamp, France, and he was the leader of the resistance in that area. So, and then I found out that one of the interrogators of Americans in Paris was Anita Hartman, who lived in New York at that time. So we got Anita, who was a part of several networks, and we got Branchou from France, and we got Dumais from Montreal, and Labrosse from Ottawa, Canada, and they came to Buffalo, New York. And I sent letters out to all of the 94 airmen on the list that Branchou had given to me. And so we had about 75 people, and 35 airmen were present when we got together in June of 1964 in Buffalo, New York. And the men then decided that it was such a good gathering, and they were so happy to see everybody, that we ought to do it again.
And do it again they did. Bill Spinning, Ralph Patton, and Bob Lowe incorporated the Escape Society in the state of Michigan. Bill Spinning, Harry Miner, and Ralph Patton designed the logo and agreed on the slogan, "We will never forget." Scotty and Clayton David found hundreds of new members. In 1967, the Society hosted a dinner at the Niagara Falls Air Base for 10 European helpers and members of the Canadian branch of the Royal Air Force's Escaping Society. In 1969, the Society and their Canadian counterpart jointly sponsored a trip to Holland, Belgium, France, and England. The societies were received by Prince Bernhard of Holland, King Baudouin and Queen Fabiola of Belgium, and Queen Elizabeth of England. Hundreds of resistance helpers joined members of the evasion societies at dinners in each of these countries. On a number of later occasions, the society sponsored trips to Europe and invited helpers to join them in happy reunion. In 1974, the society hosted 62 members of the Belgian Comet Line for a visit to New York, Detroit, and Washington, D.C. In 1976, the Society invited 52 members of the French Shelburne Line to visit Detroit, Pittsburgh, Washington, D.C., and New York. While in Washington, they were received by the French ambassador, and President Ford greeted them in the White House Rose Garden. In 1978, 32 members of the Dutch resistance were greeted by President Jimmy Carter during their visit to Washington after earlier visits to Detroit and New York. In 2004, the Society celebrated its 40th anniversary at a meeting in Valley Forge, Pennsylvania. The featured speaker was Air Force Academy graduate Lieutenant General Duncan McNabb. The reunion concluded with a visit to the New World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C. After 40 years, the Air Force's Escape and Evasion Society remained loyal to its slogan, "We will never forget the brave men and women who risked their lives to help us."